G'day guys, welcome to another episode of the Pumped On Property Show with Simon and Ben. Now today, a couple of Fridays ago, which I should have been doing on a Friday night, I know it's a bit naughty, but I picked up Akhil's book, which recently came out, The Secret Wealth Advantage. Now, we're going to talk about this book in massive detail today, but we're getting very, very close to the next GFC. And so as a duty of care to our community, to all of you guys out there that obviously follow our stuff because you want to know years in advance what could be coming and to safely prepare for that. And then not just to prepare for it, but to fully thrive in it. We really do have a once in a 20-year buying opportunity coming up. Simon and I have sort of gone really, really deep into what's happened previously. And I suppose in this one, we're going to talk about history in terms of the 3 books we've read. We're going to talk about how far away the next GFC could be. We're going to talk about how bad things can get from an American and an Australian perspective based on history. Simon's going to talk a lot about what happened in Australia in the last 2 GFCs, which is really different to what you'd expect from the sentiment at the time. We're going to talk about the 2 stages after the one we're currently in, which will most likely occur, which is the crash and then the rescue globally. And then we're also going to talk about how you can prepare and our plans for preparing personally as well. So I feel like I'm super excited to get into this stuff, man. And we're doing the exact same thing in 2017, 18 and 19.
Leading into the mid-cycle.
Exactly. So for those of you who have been following our content for the last 10 years, you would have seen heaps of videos coming out in that period of 2 to 3 years before. Just letting you know, hey, it's going to get a bit bumpy. We don't know what event's going to cause it. But generally this is what happens. And a lot of our clients, our family members, our friends got through that really, really well because it's an opportunity to thrive as well. Woof, I feel like I just spoke heaps.
I think you nailed that. It's probably the best introduction to any video ever, but we nerd out about this stuff. I feel as though these 3 books make up 60 to 80% of our conversations as brothers, as business partners, as investors, because, hands down, this is the clarity. These 3 books just gave us clarity because both you and I are curious people. We're like, there has to be a method to the madness. There has to be something out there that explains why we continue to see these economic cycles unfold in the Western world. And, we weren't the first people to have that thought, or you weren't the first person to have that thought. You go way back to W.D. Gann, you go way back to all of these old economists, Kondratiev, and then obviously in the 80s, Fred Harrison kind of reignited the fire for these cycles, and that's what Phil Anderson got into, and then Akhil Patel got into, and now Ben and Simon are getting into.
Yeah, so where this started for me and Simon as investors is probably in 2016-ish or so.
Yep.
So the market changed big time. In those couple of years, people probably aren't remembering this, but in 2015, APRA stepped in with its responsible lending standards. And so the market basically went from investors from all over the world speculating on Australia to only 1 in 10 people that were buying property allowed to be investors. And it went from really irresponsible lending, which they always do after a GFC, to re-stimulate the economy and get liquidity into the market, to going, hey, if we continue, Sydney and Melbourne are pretty much already gone up a lot, we're going to hit a car crash. And so they New Zealand did the same thing, America, Europe did the same thing, where they all just went, hang on, handbrakes back on, too much stimulation. And so by that point, I think I was suffering massive anxiety, just being honest. And I had bought 9 properties. I think I was 30 something. I can't remember at the time. But I was sitting home one night. We'd had 2 kids at the time. And I was like, there has to be a method to this madness. And I read and I read and I read, and I got to the bottom of every forum and blog. And it was about 2:00 in the morning, and I came across Ray Dalio's stuff, Big Debt Crises. And then there was a link to Phil Anderson's stuff somewhere. and he wrote this book.
And of course, Ray Dalio is aware of this stuff, right?
Big time. Like Ray's completely, he's been benefiting on it for the last 3 cycles.
You would assume Warren Buffett as well, like, big hedge funds, big
they all
business,
know
big
it, man.
investors, they're aware of this stuff. But, unless you're willing to go deep down that rabbit hole, it can be very tricky, very challenging to gain access to these books.
So I read Big Debt Crises that night, like basically didn't go to sleep. And then I ordered this book, The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking by Phil Anderson. And it was the toughest read of my entire life. Like it literally took so long to chew through the history, but it changed my life, our clients' lives, our families' lives forever, in the sense that I went, finally, someone isn't just talking shit. Finally, someone is actually looking at the history and making decisions moving forward. So let's talk about the 3 books really briefly before we get into what the cycle is. So first one is
The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking by Philip J. Anderson. So Phil, he's an Australian economist, now lives overseas, runs an investment firm called Property Share Market Economics, where they help investors like us and thousands of others understand how to use this cycle to your advantage as an investor.
So he looked at 250 odd years of American history.
Yep.
Which was off the back of Fred Harrison's work.
Which is off the back of W.D. Gann's work as well. So Fred Harrison, he's wrote multiple books. I personally believe that Fred's work is the easiest to consume because he's an author. He's not an economist.
Yeah.
So he sort of helps us understand, I guess, the underlying value that all economic cycles are tied to the land. So for some reason, these guys talk about the fact that land hasn't been written into the economic textbooks, and they think that this is purposeful. They think that it wasn't, that it was by design, and that's why we have these economic cycles, because we're not factoring in the land values into how these economies perform.
So he looked at 350 years worth of European or UK booms and busts.
Yep.
And then Akhil, which is Fred's business partner, I think he's an academic at Oxford as well.
He is, yep.
He basically recently wrote The Secret Wealth Advantage, which to me is phenomenal.
Yeah,
it's by far the best book on finance and economics I've ever read.
We're such nerds with this stuff. Like, remember a couple of weeks ago, we were driving down to Coffs Harbour and I had the Secret Wealth Advantage on, listening to it in the car, Tay in the back with my son. They're both like sleeping, and I'm just driving down the highway listening to this stuff, just going, just brain explosions, just like how does this stuff happen?
It's phenomenal. Like he's quoting things that are 2,000 years ago where people were mentioning this cycle. So the most important quote that I got out of Phil's book, The Secret Life, is there's nothing new under the sun. And Akhil, when I was reading that a few weeks ago, and in their email this week from Darren as well, basically went on to say that as we get closer to the top of the cycle, people begin to feel like something's different, even though it's not. So right now it's beginning to feel like a new world because of Bitcoin and AI. Everyone's like, and you're hearing everyone say, this time it's different. This AI is going to change the world more than electricity changed whale oil, or the horse is, redundant and now there's trains. Trains are now redundant because there's cars. Like trains are now redundant because there's aeroplanes. And every single time as humans, we think that like there's this new thing and nothing will ever be the same again. But what we're not factoring in is we're the identical version of ourselves as humans, with fear, excitement, greed, and desire. And as long as that's the prevailing human emotional system driving the technology world, that's where we're going to be stuck.
And it's no wonder. Like, let's look at the media narrative over the last 4 years. When it comes to the economy, it's like everybody feels as though we've just been through a really terrible economic time. And for some people, absolutely. But if you look at asset prices, property prices, unemployment rates, things are looking really good, underlying fundamentals. So, whilst the narrative has been negative, the markets have still been performing really well. So it is different now because we've just been through such economic hardship. But the actual fact is, all-time highs in basically all markets around the world right now.
Yeah, and so when you have a short-term bias, which Tony Robbins talks about in one of these books behind us, Money Master the Game, which was very good too, particularly Ray Dalio's component of the book, we have a short-term recency bias. And so a market that's done well, we assume is going to do well. We overvalue assets based on what they've done recently, and we neglect 10-year, 20-year, 50-year, 100-year histories. And so ultimately from these three books, these guys found a pattern in a system globally, which is really just one thing, the availability of money and how people feel about that at the same time. And that's all it is. So basically we have a GFC. I'm using my hands even though most people...
You're going to have to do it backwards as well.
Sheesh, my brain's tripping. We go up for roughly 7 years.
Yep.
We hit COVID, which is called the mid-cycle slowdown, also called the dot-com boom and crash, also called the Cuban Missile Crisis. It always is some fearful event, which is a real event. Like the world changes forever from those three things. Like COVID, these are horrible things that just happen at around about the same stage. And the market goes, whoa, backwards for a couple of years. But the market and the governments at the time step in and they can get us out of it, like with the COVID bailout scheme internationally. We go through another period of good times. Up, we go through like the winner's curse at the top, which we're in now, effectively, which is the 2 years before the top of the cycle, where everything goes into all-time highs and people go, shit.
And everyone feels amazing.
FOMO, everyone's making money right now in gold, crypto, stocks, property. Everyone's like, well, this is never going to stop. I missed the last 5 years, let's go. And it can be a phenomenal time to be in the market too. Like it can be one of the most profitable times in a cycle, as long as you're not buying the stock that is fully overpriced or the property that's fully overpriced, and you're picking off the ones that are underperforming relative to the market.
And so long as you're not trying to speculate and make short-term money, you've got to start thinking longer term. And once we go into what happened in the last two recessions and recoveries, you'll start to see that there's plenty of opportunity out there as well. But obviously, when things get to this point in time, the system cracks. And then we have a crisis or a crash where, basically everything drops. It's important to know with this cycle and with the work from these three authors, it's all based on the United States and the United Kingdom and the EU. Australia is not even on their radar because we're a drop in the ocean in comparison to. So, we've used this analysis, used this information, and then localized it here in Australia because that's everything to us.
So an important question so that you can sleep tonight, and I can as well, is, how far away is the next GFC? I've got no idea, but according to the updates that we're getting from Phil, Akhil, and the team at Property Share Market Economics, emailed to us every single week as part of their subscription, within the next 2 years. Like by 2027, we should be really close to a top, is basically what they're saying at the moment. So the reason we're bringing this to you so early is just because it's important to get ahead of the curve and not be like, oh shit, the stock market just went down 60% and I wasn't ready for that, or whatever's going to come.
Yep. So obviously 2 years, we've got a fair bit of time. Generally in this 2 year period, you'll start to feel really good. You'll hear that the media narrative changes, very optimistic, very positive. We just got to look at the last couple of weeks since Trump got elected as a bit of a sample size to what it can feel like at this stage. Everything's going well, all of these positive reforms coming in, and that sentiment will continue to improve and will get better and better, and stocks will continue doing better and better. But it's just a time to be aware of what could come next, and how can you get your house in order, and how can you prepare yourself to completely take advantage of what's to come.
So in terms of the next question, which is how bad things can get, in Australia, based on the history, like the Australian stock market very closely follows everywhere else in the world. So based on history and Phil's research, about a 35 to 60% drop in stock prices is what we normally see in a GFC, and about an 8 to 12% drop in house prices. Now, in some areas, this is really important, and you just mentioned it too. Some could be as bad as 50%, like the Gold Coast last GFC, Noosa. I mean, 1 in every 3 properties in Noosa was being forced sold by the bank last GFC. The really expensive houses are the ones that generally come down, the holiday homes, the inner city units.
The speculated regions.
The speculated mining regions as well. But on average, Sydney and Melbourne in the last 3 cycles, so Phil looked at the 14 years up and the 4 years down for the last 60 years or 3 cycles, and he found that an 8 to 12% drop in house prices was what we'd normally see in Australia, which was nothing. As soon as I heard
that back in 2022.
By the time you look at your stamp duty on the way in, plus your closing costs, holding costs, exit fees and taxes, it would have to drop by 30% to even warrant the So for me, it doesn't make sense to be like trading in and out to try and like, well, should I sell everything to get ready for a fucking 8% drop when it's cost you 25% to get out? No. But we'll come back to like Phil's and Akhil's thoughts on how you can prepare as well, like for ourselves. The interesting thing was Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane averaged 125% up in the 14 years up. So that's important right now, because if you look at particularly Brisbane and Melbourne, they've probably only done, like some of the suburbs have done 150% since the last GFC in both cities, but you and I know suburbs that have done 50 to 70%. So if you're gonna buy, you can't buy, there's 523 suburbs within 60 Ks of Melbourne. There is 418 or 20 suburbs in Brisbane. And of them, I would handpick 50 in Brisbane and probably 25, 30 in Melbourne. So it's like, you're not just going to buy and ride up. You've got to be very, very specific with what you're looking for. And that's why we're starting to do more which suburbs in Brisbane, which suburbs in Melbourne videos as well on YouTube.
Now, talking about the US, because they experience much more dramatic declines at the end of cycle, as does the UK and Europe.
Yeah, so 35 to 60% drops in the stock market.
Same.
Yeah, what's interesting is when you look at 120 years of American stock charts or Australian, like obviously we haven't had a stock market for that long, but people were trading and they bring that past in. We see that certain stocks can drop as much as 95% and others might only drop 20%. So again, it's value dependent with all assets, but a big drop in the market and then a very, very, very quick recovery too. This is the thing that's blown my mind. But then the houses can get smashed. So 10 to 35% drops. And that's, everyone's already hearing about ninja loans in America right now. The thing that created the last GFC, which was effectively stacking heaps of shit things together and pretending it was good, is happening again, and it's being relabeled as something else.
It's time to go and watch The Big Short again and sort of
short time.
Have a look at what happened last time. And, you know, I always say to people when they ask, who is this Phil Anderson character? And I say, he's kind of like the Australian version of Michael Burry.
100%.
Like he's, you know...
Which is the dude on the drums who just ends up getting people a 400% return in the GFC.
Yeah, the guy that predicted it and you know, went balls to the wall and sort of shorted all of the US bank stocks because he could see the writing on the wall. And, you know, Phil has made some life-changing returns from his predictions of these cycles, the peaks, the drops, and the recoveries.
Now, what's important to note is, like, these are deadly if you're at a stage of life where you're relying on it. So let's say you're a retiree with $1 million in stocks and it drops 60%. It effectively has to, like, so a 50% decline in your money, like $1 million to 500K, a 50% decline means that you need 100% increase just to get back to the same level. So returns and declines become very, very damaging if you're like living off the income. But for long-term investors and for people that are younger, like sub 50, sub 60, it's a phenomenal once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to double your money if you know how to do it.
There's obviously a lot of psychology to do with it though as well, because if you make the mistake and buy the wrong stocks at the wrong time and you lose all of that money, a lot of people mentally go into a more conservative investment strategy off the back of that because they're like, I don't want to go through that again. And so it takes even longer to recoup those gains as well. Whereas when you look back at the stock market and when you see drops of more than 50% in a single year, how long does it take for that to recover?
In 120 years of Australian data, I couldn't see a period ever where it didn't fully recover within 2 years.
Wow.
So if it went down by 60%, in the 2 years after it went up 73.
It's insane.
Etc. So it's like, it's super scary. But you know,
Nobody
so's
likes,
life, man.
yeah, well,
Don't jump in a
exactly.
car. So what happened in Australia in the last GFC, 2 GFCs?
Yep.
Now, the last one was called the GFC. The one before that was called the recession we had to have.
Yeah.
This new one won't be called the GFC. It will have a new name.
Yeah.
But what happened from a property perspective in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth?
Yeah, so if we go all the way back to the recession that we had to have, anybody that's a little bit older would remember what happened in the 80s. Like, everyone was killing it. You know, everyone was making money. The unemployment rates were low. Inflation was high, yes, but property prices skyrocketed. So did stock prices.
Well,
so
interest rates were also like, people that had money
17,
killed it in
18%.
the 80s.
yeah,
But interest rates were also as high as 18%.
to combat
so it's like,
inflation at the time.
yeah, so people like our mum and dad, for example, didn't kill it. They were fucked from the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
But if you had money, imagine getting 24% returns a year.
Dad also bought at the very peak of that cycle as well in
which
Sydney.
most people
So,
do.
1990, give or take, was really the I guess downturn, the recession period of that particular cycle. So 1990 to 1994, that period of time, Sydney lost 6%. So 4 years, negative 6% is a pretty bad return for Sydney. Like, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's a hard time.
That was a very terrible time. 4 years, 5 years technically. So Melbourne over the same period went up 14%. Brisbane was up 37%, being the top performer over that period of time, and then Perth 19%. Now, during the recovery, 1995 to 2001, this is where property price in Sydney started to perform quite well, up 66%. Melbourne, 73%. So from 1990 to 2001, property prices in Melbourne absolutely skyrocketed, almost doubled. Brisbane was up 22% and Perth 26%. So what we realised when we studied these cycles in Australia is that typically we see Melbourne and Sydney, the biggest markets in Australia, lead the recovery. And then we see, after the mid-cycle slow down, your satellite cities or secondary cities like your Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide's, they perform extremely well in the second half of the cycle. And then as we get to, this part of the cycle, you see a lot of regional markets because everyone's looking around at property prices in the capital cities and just cannot justify the money required to get in. So they look for the next best alternative. Now, looking to the most recent, the GFC, 2007 to 2010, prices in Sydney actually went up 18%, which is pretty strong growth. Melbourne up 44%, top performing market from 2007 to 2010. Brisbane up 37% and Perth up 23%. So what that data tells me, and this is from Homely, from Successful Ways, they got the information from Successful Ways, a finance company in Sydney. It didn't really have any major impact on the major capital cities in Australia last time.
We'll talk about why in a second after you walk them through the recovery.
Now, the recovery, 2011 to 2016, I would have loved to have 17, 18, 19, 20 as well, but we just didn't have it.
Basically, it just looks like this. Like it went off its head.
61% in Sydney over that period of time, 35.5% in Melbourne, Brisbane 12.2%, Perth 14.9%.
It's exactly what we'd expect to see.
Exactly. So, I don't think we really know exactly why Australia wasn't as affected as the United States.
Yeah, like here's the conspiracy side of the podcast coming down now, which is what Simon and I were really waiting for. Okay, so the first thing here is Phil Anderson in preparation, knowing everything he knew, and he was publicly stating in 2005 and 6 in all of the media in Europe that it's coming. he got fully prepared for it to go buy Melbourne at 50 cents in the dollar, and then Melbourne went up 44%. So this is the guy that physically wrote the book on crashes, getting it completely wrong, not being able to borrow any money in Australia at all, and having to go buy one property in London in cash with a friend.
Which he killed it on.
Killed it on. And obviously this is the thing, guys, like no one has a crystal ball. None of the authors do either. The years loosely line up based on history, but it's always different, even for the experts. And so I don't pretend to sit here to know why or how or what. I just know that human nature is when money is easy and cheap to get and the global system wants you to get it, everything booms. When it's very hard to get and the system is undersupplied from a finance perspective, then things go down. And so something that saved Australia, there's two things that I think. One is we let in 900,000 people. As soon as we saw the American market drop 50%, our drop came 6 to 9 months post that. We just started to open the floodgates, and every one of those people pays 10 to 50K to get in. That's a whole lot of revenue.
And the vast majority of these people moved to Melbourne as well. So it really stimulated that market, why we saw so much capital growth in those years down in Melbourne as well.
Yep. And then the second reason I think is the Australian banking system is so conservative because it's so over leveraged in property that it can't be anything else. Like 60% of the major four banks' balance sheets is property related. Maybe that's what they say to us. Maybe it's like 90%.
It could be more. And then obviously China helped us last time. So we were still going through a mining boom in 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11. We were still going through a mining boom. So China was buying all of our natural resources, heaps of iron ore, heaps of coal. So we had great employment. So when the global economy is struggling and, you know, property prices, stock prices have dropped dramatically in the United States and the UK and in Europe, well, hey, you can go earn 200K, or maybe not that much at the time.
300.
Yeah, however much you were earning in the mines back in those days in a nice, safe economy where we haven't been as negatively impacted by this end of cycle recession. So, you know, that had a massive impact as to, well, I don't know. I'm just speculating.
It did though, because 200,000 to 300,000 people left Perth when the mining boom ended, and they all ended up in Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah.
So, you know, and
which I'd do the same. You know, if I'm earning big money in WA and then they sack me,
well, that's where the big jobs
I'm
are.
going to go back to my family. I'm going to go back to where the money is.
Big time. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why these things happen. But I think, you know, coming into the next phase, so right now we're in the peak, the winner's curse. According to these guys, we're 2 years away from the top. Now, that's cool. Like at this particular point, we'll talk about what we're doing in a moment, what Phil's doing. I've got to catch up with him on Thursday. But basically, the first stage of the GFC is called the crash, right? Now, according to Akhil's book, The Secret Wealth Advantage, there's always a trigger event, which effectively is like COVID, like 9/11. It's where the weakest part of the financial system globally cracks. And it might be like, this bank just went under. What the hell? That's a 140-year-old bank and it just went under. And then that sends a little ripple through, and then people start looking at their own balance sheets and go, we're all in here and there's nothing we can do about it because the liquidity stops. So basically it's a place where the entire world, the governments, the banks, and the individuals are over leveraged with bad debt.
The way to look at it is everyone is all in.
All in. Now, I know a lot of people listening to this have massive equity and cash at the moment, and that's because we're not all in.
No, there's so much money still sitting on the sidelines, which is what we talked about in the most recent monthly market update as well.
1.5 trillion in bank accounts in Australia right now, according to CBA.
Yep.
So
that's not all in.
What happens is we get this trigger event, the weakest part in the system starts cracking, and people go, fuck, we've been here before, let's actually have a look. And as they start peeling the paint, it rips a hole.
And because this is a land boom, what Akhil and Phil talk about at the peak of the cycle and as we move into the crash is these real estate investment trusts, the REITs. They're the ones that start to crack first, because these are the companies that are the heavily they're most invested into the land market. And so once they start to underperform, that is generally what's happened in the history in the past, that they're the first ones to start to drop off.
They're the canary in the coal mine, because the stock market's always pricing 6 to 9 months in advance.
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, our profitability is going down because the pipeline of work isn't there, because they can't access cash anymore.
But it could be different next time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably will be.
Could be different. Like, I'm just laughing because
I've got
it's
my
like
speculation of what it will be.
I mean, the REIT's always like, regardless of what the trigger event isn't them not developing.
Yeah.
The trigger event is like something.
They're also sort of
systematic.
generally, screaming and yelling from the peak of their building, saying like the economy's recovered.
Rushing it.
We're in the best position that we've ever been. The good times are going to go on. I can just imagine Trump's speech when that time comes in a couple of years
Well,
from now.
Trump's speech like a week ago was like, we're in the golden age.
Yeah.
He's already said it.
He's
Like,
already
he's
said it.
already ringing the bell for
Yeah.
like the next 2 years. So it's already the American golden age is his language. Like, it's going to be better than ever. And then we get a rush for liquidity where this isn't like mum and dad's at this point. This is where the banks go, we're fucked.
Yeah.
Let's go get money from the central banks. And then the central banks go, we can't give you money.
Now, these books are epic, and if you want to learn about it properly, you read these books, but there's a great movie. So if you want to look at what happens as we get to the peak, it's the movie that I mentioned before, The Big Short.
Yeah.
But if you want to see what big hedge funds and big banks do once they realize shit's about to hit the fan, Margin Call. Amazing movie to watch that tells you about what these big hedge funds, what these big banks will do.
I haven't seen that actually, but what do they do? They basically go stuff every single person
They
in
just-
their clients up and take
So
money back.
long as the owners of the banks and the shareholders walk, not even the shareholders, just the owners of the banks walk away not losing too much money, it's just pass it all on to the mum and dad investors.
Yeah.
So these guys don't get burned. That's why like back in 2008 through 2010, you didn't see too many bankers or hedge funds get prosecuted.
Jail. Yeah. I think there was one.
Yeah.
They're saying to be short, maybe a few more. So then the banks begin failing. And because the banks are failing, the businesses begin failing. And then the market panics and we get a market crash in the stock market and we get about 35 to 60% average decline. And then from that, because the stock market's always looking at the economy 6 to 9 months in advance, then the property market crashes as well. The main emotion of that time is panic and fear. And we've all heard the runs at the banks. We've all heard of the Great Depression was another example of a GFC. For me, and for people like me, and everybody listening to this, it's a once or twice in a lifetime buying opportunity.
Yep.
But it is so difficult as humans to do the opposite to other people.
It's really rough, and we've talked about this off camera a bunch, like just when you're born and when your investment journey starts, like it sucks so much that you don't have much control over that. You can't choose when you're born, you can't choose, well, you can sort of choose when you first start investing, but an example is like you're in your early 20s, you'd hustled hard, build up that deposit, you bought your first property in 2011 in Sydney at the beginning of the cycle.
Yeah.
Like that's just convenient. For me personally, I was in my mid 20s at like just before the mid-cycle slowdown, where I know that Brisbane historically cranks after the mid-cycle slowdown. I went out there and bought as much as I could, leveraged up to my eyeballs at that point in time. Like that's just good fortune that I was at the age, in the financial position to do it at that right time. And it's just like, you don't have much control over those things. And that's why it's important to learn these things, because it will help dictate when you should get into the market.
And the important thing here is like every single piece of information ever written on finance says that time in the market is better than timing the market.
Always.
And so if you had bought at the absolute top of Perth or Sydney last GFC, before the last GFC, then you would have still doubled your money by now. And that's an important thing to note.
Let's look, 2011 to 2016, 15% in Perth, like almost 13% in Brisbane, 35% in Melbourne, 61 in Sydney. Like, how have you bought in 2007 in Brisbane? From 2007 to 2010, it went up 37%. So So there's still massive opportunity.
Big opportunity. So, you know, I think it's important to note that regardless of when you buy, if it's the right high quality asset long term, in 20 to 40 years, you'll be phenomenally better off than not doing anything. But this is just like, this is like down the wormhole stuff. Like, if you want to go from like a mum and dad investor to an actual professional investor like we are that just only does this for a living, then this is the sort of stuff that can give you an edge. After the crash comes what they call, or Akhil calls in The Secret Wealth Advantage, the rescue, which is effectively, there's a great quote actually in the book, which I'll try and find really quickly. And he basically says in the rescue, do you want to talk about something for a second, Simon, while I find this?
You know, first thing that generally happens in the rescue is we'll see a reduction in interest rates because, you know, we obviously know that that's going to re-stimulate the economy. Governments will eventually bail out the banks, not the mums and dads, but the big banks, because they have to. Otherwise, you know, the banks are all going to fail and then everybody loses their money.
This is the quote relating to that I wanted to find. So this is in chapter 17 called The Rescue. If we don't do this, like quotes, bank rescue, we may not have an economy on Monday. And that was the chairman of the Fed Reserve in September 2008.
There you go.
So basically, it gets to a point where the entire system is going to collapse without governments around the world stepping in.
And these guys don't talk about it, but if you want to learn more about how money is created, what fiat currency is, why the Federal Reserves exist, what their purpose is, The Creature from Jekyll Island by Howard G. Griffin, like same as The Secret Life and Banking, but worse in terms of history and doomsdaying, and, you know, really heavy book to read. But it kind of tells you about how and why these things happen. You know, I struggled my way through that. If I had have been able to.
Pretty negative book, isn't it?
Super. I couldn't even read more than like 20 pages a week. Like, it was just heavy on my brain at the time. Yeah. I still haven't finished the entire book, but it's a wild read.
You know, and we go from there where the governments go, okay, we've got to do something. And then we get a rescue package, which always goes to the banks first. And then into the wider economy. So basically the rescue package is effectively the banks or the government's going, here's a monster amount of money to improve your books. And at the same time, the banks are getting rid of all of their crappy assets that they held from the last top, like just secretly in the background, just improving their balance sheet. And then with that flood of money, they get structured in a way again where they can start leveraging and using money again, because the governments know that the banks have to be lending money for the economy to be doing its thing. Businesses, individuals, investors need money. And as that money starts moving through the economy again, that's how we move into the first stage of the cycle again. There's a sort of rescue in the property market. The way that they do this is they increase the amount of cash in the system. They reduce the entry requirements for borrowing. So for example, after the last GFC in Sydney, I could get a 97.5% banked back loan. 2.5% deposit is what they were letting me do.
Was that for everyone or just first home buyers?
I don't know. Like,
yeah, they
no
really
one else is buying.
They really incentivize first home buyers at that point in time, I think, as well. In Australia.
I remember spending that whole year of 2011 driving around with our mate Macca. Just every weekend we're either up at Newcastle, the Central Coast or the Gong, and we'd go to like 11 or 12 open homes a day on a Saturday, and I couldn't see it. I never bumped into a single other person. Like, everyone that knew what they were doing, which I didn't even know we'd gone through a GFC because I was at uni the year before, was like just scared still.
Yeah, and you're not aware of this stuff when you're in your teens and early 20s. Like, you're just not exposed to it. But as you start to get more money in your super, more assets, you know, that's when people really start to get affected by this. Like our dad, you know, his super got slashed by 50% during the GFC. You know, that crushes you.
Yeah,
mentally crushes you at that point in time. You know, he was in his late 50s at that point.
Yeah, it's a real thing. Like, it absolutely belts people. I think that's why so many people didn't retire at 55 and are now retiring at 70, because it took them 15 years to get back to where they were. Other things that happen at that time is the rates go right down. So in terms of the setup at exactly this stage last cycle, rates are going to come down again. Like according to the Reserve Bank of Australia, 3.25%. America, Trump is like on a mission to cut rates to as low as he can get them. All around the world, he's cutting them right now as well. They'll cut, then we'll get to this trigger event top, and they'll go shit, got to get money in. Leading into the last GFC, rates in Australia went up 21 or 23 times in a year and a half. They put it up. And then to re-stimulate the economy and the rescue, they'll cut them back down. So let's say that by the time we get to the next top, they're at 5%, 5.5% retail. They could go as high as 7 to 9%, and then they'll cut them back again, but only after the rescue. And that's part of what creates the bleed, because people don't expect their rates to go up so quickly and to be financially smashed, because they might get sacked at that time as well.
Unemployment rates typically do go up in that crash as well.
Yeah, so I looked back at the history in the Great Depression and in the GFC, and unemployment rates in the Great Depression was supposed to be like 18 to 35%. But if you looked at people with trade backgrounds or university education, it was 6%.
That's wild.
So it's important to go, there's a story. Of course, if you're working in a bar and no one's got money to spend money in a bar, you're going to get sacked. But if you're like, education is like one of the silver bullets through these things. Same in the last GFC, unemployment rates were crazy. Like I remember being at IBM at that time, and they sacked 200,000 people the year that I started out of 400,000 people. Luckily, first year grads weren't the people that I was sacking.
Yeah, not paying you much money.
Yeah.
We can afford to keep you.
But yeah, so I suppose it's just interesting to have a look at these things. It's an incredible time during the rescue phase, according to these guys and from my own experience, to buy stocks cheap and to buy property cheap.
Yeah, in the right location.
Phenomenal opportunity in time.
Yeah. It's been unfolding as these guys talk about, well over 350 years in Europe and the UK, well over 250 years in the United States, well over 120 years here in Australia. So, this is as close to concrete that you can get, but obviously every single cycle is slightly different in length and, the reasons that all of these things do pop up. But that's like a little bit of history. So it's like, cool, how do we prepare?
Yeah, so preparing, these are just some of the things that you and I were writing before this. One thing that I'm doing at the moment, because we're not financial advisors, and how people prepare, like go and talk to your accountant, your financial advisor, or sit down on your own or with your partner and figure out your own plan. But I'm reducing my debts big time right now.
Yeah, as am I as well.
What kills people is when your income reduces and your debts go higher at the same time, and you get into your own liquidity problem.
Let's also caveat that with both of us are carrying more debt than we probably should be at the moment as well.
Without a doubt.
We both went super hard in the mid-cycle slowdown, gearing up for the second half of the real estate cycle. And so it was always a part of our plan to reduce the debts at this point in time, because, just can't sustain living like that for an extended period of time.
Not with 7% interest rates, 2.5%, 3%, buffers you from the reality of the real market. The other thing that I'm personally doing at the moment is refinancing all of my properties to interest only. Mm-hmm. Now, this certainly isn't something that I'd recommend for everyone, but I'm a good saver and I have offset accounts with all of my properties that I can put cash in as I save it. But the reason I'm doing it now is because when the banks and the global governments get into their liquidity issue in 2 or 3 or 4 years from now, they will not let you refinance. So if you're on interest only at the moment and you think in 3 years' time that CBA is going to let you go 5 years again interest only when they're trying to bring every cent they can back in to fix their bank, there's fucking no world that exists where they're going to do that. One of our clients is the head of property buying for the biggest property buyer in Australia. We've helped him buy, it's funny because he's the number one dude in the country, but we buy his personal properties for him, which I love. But he said that in the last GFC, I'm talking they're sitting on billions of dollars worth of property. He couldn't even get their position changed with all of their relationships in the bank, and their interest rates literally doubled because they were like, well, you guys can afford it. The banks just hit them up for the money.
Very little to no negotiating at that point.
Zero. he couldn't borrow money, he couldn't refinance, and they doubled his rates.
You know, the other thing to prepare is, if you're in a position to do so, is increasing your income in any way, shape or form, whether that's through your wage or through your investments as well. You know, like a lot of our clients, you know, and us as well, have the capacity to build granny flats on their investment properties, which takes those properties from a negatively geared situation to a neutral or positively geared situation, even on these higher interest rates. So, you know, figuring out unique ways to increase the income. If you've been the nice guy, letting your tenants have below market value rents, you know, if you can continue doing that, cool, but it might be a time to start talking to your property manager. Hey, how can I increase the income on my investments so that, you know, you can increase your income and reduce your expenses? It's really the two most important things.
You know, I talked to a client recently, Ben, from the Goldie, and he was paying an average of about $3,000 to $3,500 per year in in insurance on each of his properties. And he's got lots now, like 7 or 8. And I said, well, look, the way that I do it, through either working with an insurance broker or going direct through someone like Allianz Online, was just, you know, I pay 100% of the money up front, which not everyone can do. Some people have to go month to month. I get that. But if you can, and then I set the excess personally as high as it can be, which I'm prepared to take that risk on. A lot of people won't. That's fine as well. And then I set the replacement value at a realistic number. And by doing that, and him doing the same thing, he was able to bring his cost of insurance down by 50%.
Massive.
So while you're reducing your big debts, like getting better interest rates, maybe looking at interest only, other ways is like, well, if you're paying your property manager 10% and Ray White in the area is doing 7 to 8%, or you're paying $3,000 or $4,000 in insurance and it could be $1,500, maybe all of these things are like low-hanging piece of fruit, where in boom times you don't need to do them. But in preparing for bust times, it's a good way to just cut little line items out of your life, which is why, like, I was talking to our dad this week and I had to call him off my work phone because my personal phone with Audi had run out of credit, as it does. And he's like,
you can automate that, by the way.
You're earning good enough money. Yeah, I need to like not worry about this. Like, why aren't you worth Telstra? And I'm like, because 3 phones is $300 versus with Audi it's $45 a month. And so it's like all of those little things like are just massive savings. And then I go,
it's like, why not?
Why not?
Why pay $80 when you can pay $20?
It's exactly
the same service.
Only buy quality assets from today forward.
Yeah, that's the big one.
You cannot, like I said before, just rush into Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane and buy anything. You need to be buying the undervalued property types, which right now are affordable houses and townhouses. Absolutely stay away from units, in my opinion. Based on history, they've underperformed.
Consistently.
And if you're going into like a Melbourne or a Brisbane, which are 2 out of our 3 favourite markets at the moment, as well as Townsville, then, you know, I know not everyone has the time to look at 1,000 suburbs between those markets like we just have, but if you can look at the 10-year growth rate, like go for the markets that haven't done 10 or 12 or 8%, go for the ones that have done 2% in Townsville or 5% in Melbourne and Brisbane.
Exactly. 5, 6, 7% in Melbourne and Brisbane. There's, you know, probably collectively almost 100 suburbs between the 2 markets that have underperformed. And knowing that both of those markets typically do 120% during a growth cycle, we're starting to get into a safer place in those areas. So quality fundamentals matter. Like, you can't speculate at this time of the cycle. You just have to follow the fundamentals. So, you know, buying houses on good piece of land in good quality locations in these undervalued regions, buying things where you can manufacture some cash flow in any way, shape or form, because if you can get a property that pays for its own interest and maybe some of the holding costs, then, you know, you're putting yourself into a much safer situation. And like, I personally would be typically avoiding like heavily negatively geared properties at this stage as well.
It's a big one. I didn't even think of that, but absolutely.
Yeah.
And if I'm looking at what I'm offloading at the moment, because I'm selling, I've just sold one, I've hopefully sold another one literally today, and then maybe even one more. Like, I don't know if I will sell that next one or not, but they are the ones with the highest debt, with the worst incomes, with the most amount of stuff that can go wrong, with the most amount of variability in the markets that have already done their sort of 9 to 15% growth. So I'm like, I'm not, you know what I mean? I'm rinsing your last little bit, getting out of the coast, because nowhere in Australia has done as well as the sunny coast and the Goldie in the last 10 years at all. Nowhere even close.
Yeah. And, you know, also just not over leveraging. Like I talk to 15 investors every single week, and, you know, a very common trend for a lot of investors is like, I want to buy a property every year, or I want to buy a property every 2 years. And, you know, I love that ambition. I love people that are willing to, you know, sacrifice and go for it to try and improve their financial future.
Which is what we both did. We fully get it.
But do it in a safe way. You know, like there is good times to buy, and you know, there's good times to be a little bit more cautious. It really depends on where you're at as an investor and where you're headed in the future as well. You know, for young guys like me and my friends that are sort of just at the very beginning of their journey, if you follow these fundamentals and if you buy in the right locations and you do generate good income, you know, it's a great time, and there's still so much opportunity out there. And like, I'm really gearing myself up to get into the Melbourne market as soon as possible, because like, you know, I've done really well in Brisbane. You know, the suburbs that I'm invested in have already done 9-10% over the last 10 years. So they're, you know, getting close. So, you know, exiting out of that and then being able to be in a position where I can go and target the next, what I believe to be Australia's top performing capital city.
You know, and this is the thing, I don't want to spook people with this today.
No.
Because a lot of people, when I was putting out this content with you in 17, 18, 19, were scared.
Yep.
And the title's clickbaity, like the next GFC is coming, are you ready? Like, fuck off. If I saw that show up in my algorithm, I'd just be like, fuck you, bro. Like, don't wreck my day. Because a lot of people aren't going to get to this point.
We've wrecked a few days, but like, we're excited, not fearful of these things.
Yeah.
Just got to get educated.
Education, you know, look, in your numbers here, 2007 to 2010, Melbourne did 44%, Brisbane did 37%. Like, what are we talking about here? So it's just a case of like being aware that there's big opportunity here. But I suppose our plan for the next GFC, as you said, is education and training and preparation means you're preparing for the next opportunity. And that's what we're doing at the moment. Like, we're excited about it. It's going to be a once in our lifetime buying opportunity. It's at the prime of like my financial life personally to date, and you're going to be in the same position.
Yeah, like, because by the time this crash comes and then the next, which crash, it's just a fucking word. Like, look at the numbers that we talked about just before. Then they're not crash numbers, but it's just, I'm going to be 34, 35, and it's like prime time, knowing that I've got 14 years, so from 35 to 49, got 14 years of prosperous times in front of me. Like, personally, I am going to rinse that cycle.
Big time.
Like, as big and as much as I can. But what I need to do right now is deeply, deeply educate myself on the areas of the economy that I'm not familiar with, so I can take advantage of these areas as well.
You know, this is the important thing. So let's say that people go, okay, I'm only going to do really smart stuff in the next few years, and then I'm going to like hit up Pumped on Property when no one else is buying. At the start of COVID, I went out for 9 months inspecting properties and didn't see a single other person at one property once. We just bought properties that didn't drop for 40% below what they were worth because no one else was offering on them, and they were only scared people selling them. So I think it's important to know that. I think it's important to know as well, in his book, the average American stock market upside in the 14 years up in history of the stock market has been 450% growth from the bottom to the top. And from the bottom to the mid-cycle has been an average of 220% up. The average in Sydney that you and I found when we looked at the data in the first 7 years up was more than 80% growth, and from bottom to top was 125%. In Brisbane and Perth, the average was 127% up over a cycle. So this shouldn't be like a fearful thing. This should be like I'm going to buy assets at the best possible price and hold them and completely change my stars and my families. My personal strategy right now is, I don't know anything about this, but I'm going to do a bit of gold because I know the gold chart and I know that I don't know anything. But for me personally, I'm prepared to put a tiny bit into
You'll
gold.
probably take Phil's advice.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, he's saying every single week, gold and silver.
Gold.
But, you know, I looked at the charts going into the 2 years before the last GFC and the 2 years into it, and then the one before that. And like the charts speak for themselves. Gold did 180, 200%. So did silver both times. I'm going to get the stocks when they dip. And I'm going to get the distressed property. I'm already starting to build the relationships with the bank. So I've always worked with brokers. I'm now going direct to corporate bank managers because I want to be able to go, hey, Rach, I know that you've got 3,000 or 4,000 distressed properties now that you need to get rid of. Call me. I want to look at every single one of them.
Yeah.
Next time, like in the last GFC, there are $5 million properties on Noosa Waters right now that were selling for $600,000 in 2011 that a year before were selling for fucking 3 mil. So it's just who you know. And I've watched $1 Million Listing New York. I've seen like some of the solicitors that bought like 100 mansions because they were the ones representing the people that were selling them distressed for the banks. And then, like we know that New York does very well like Sydney in the first half of cycle. The year before COVID, they sold 98 out of the 100 of them. Like these guys know this stuff. It's just the case of like now that we know it, now that you guys know it.
Take advantage of it.
And then Victoria and Brisbane are the only two markets, as well as Townsville, that I'm going to be focused on personally.
Yeah, and I think there will be some good opportunities as things unfold, you know, like Sunny Coast, Gold Coast, Wollongong, Newcastle, Sydney, you know, Geelong, Mornington. Like there is so many markets that are going to look really attractive.
The more holiday homes, the more distressed sales, the better the prices.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, I'll probably do a couple of speckies on something like that because, you know, it'd be really nice to pick up one of those waterfront properties on Oceanic for a cheap price.
Yeah, like talking to one of my favourite agents who sold a few of my houses for me, Minka, she is a legend. She is an absolute baller on the Sunny Coast, one of the top performing agents. And she got herself into a pickle last GFC with her business because like she expected it to never stop, and then her income just stopped because no one wanted to buy or sell for 3 years. And certain markets like the Sunny Coast and Goldie get rinsed hard because 1 in 3 properties up here are someone's holiday home from Sydney and Melbourne or overseas. She sold her $1.8 million house at the top for 800 grand on Oceanic Drive.
Wow.
Now, it wasn't that was worth that. It was just because no one was buying because everyone was looking at the papers going, fuck, the stock market's at 50%, and that's scary.
Yeah, and people aren't aware of these things, so they think that they have to sell it for that, knowing that had if she just figured out a way to hold it through for 2-3 years, it would have rebounded.
Yeah, well, now that same property's worth 3 mil, right? Like,
4.
Yeah.
4 now. It's crazy.
Wow, that's actually crazy. That's a bit sad.
Yeah, it's heavy, but you know, these are the things that happen, right? Like people think that it's going to change. People think that, you know, it's going to last a hell of a lot longer than it does. But, you know, the first thing to overcoming these challenges and these fears is awareness. And that's all we're trying to do is bring the awareness to you. But do the deep dive like we have, you know, don't trust a 1.5 hour podcast that we've talked about our secondhand experience. Like go read the books and double down on this stuff and then formulate your own opinion, your own strategy, sit down with your own team of advisors to figure out what's best for you, because it's the biggest investment opportunity is coming in probably everybody that's listening to this podcast life. You need to be in a great financial position to capitalize on that.
Phil Anderson, who wrote the book, who we catch up with regularly and I'm catching up with this week, for $500 an hour, the guy that wrote the book on this cycle will sit down with you and chat. That's insane. Like when you actually think about it. Like,
he won't if you don't know his book.
Yeah, like I'd say don't talk to this guy without reading his stuff
if you're asking him questions and the answers are in the book, he'll tell you to F off, go read the book.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just wanted to say to everyone still listening to this that I'm so grateful that we're not in this alone anymore, and that this community, like we're just here to educate you guys. It's all secondhand knowledge, as Simon said, go check it out. But these books have changed our lives. Like, and a direct example of this working, for example, is like we told our mum, auntie, uncle, a whole bunch of your friends, like all of our family members about what Brisbane can do in the second half of the cycle. All of them have bought. There's not a single one of them that hasn't made 200K to 600 grand on what they bought. Like my mum going into the last mid-cycle slowdown, I told her that I'd spoken to Phil. He'd said that this is coming, and that this was his personal response. She sold her, like, I'm not saying that this is good for anyone. I'm just saying this is what my mum did. It's a story. She sold her stocks, went into cash. She saved herself the 35, 40% decline in COVID, and then she rebought when everything was cheap and almost doubled her money again. So like, these things are not theoretical. These are real things that have a real tangible impact on, like, who cares about stocks and property really? All they are, like I do, but I mean,
they're tools.
They're tools to get free, to create the life of your dreams, to like spend time with the people you care about, to do the things you love, to serve the world, to train more, to travel more, to volunteer more, to spend more time with your kids, to pick them up, to drop them off from school, to cut down your work hours, to start that business you really want to start. Like, it's a tool and a vehicle to get to where you want to be, but it is not the destination is who can own more. The destination is get there safely with your personal risk profile and stomach to where you want to be.
It's all about the journey. We know that. And if you can make that journey the path of least resistance with the least amount of suffering, then, you know, that's going to be more conducive to a happy life. Like, you could make mistakes and, you know, tell us that we're conspiracy theorists and tell us that we're, you know, crackheads. And
no one believes this, by the way. Like,
yeah,
these guys don't sell copies of these books.
No, it's crazy. But, you know, you could have those failures and, you know, be the hundreds or if not thousands of people that I've talked to over the years that bought in these mining towns at the peak of the cycle and lost all their money and then thought the property wasn't for them and they can't succeed. So then their journey has been held back compared to the people that buy the fundamentals, buy the right assets in the right markets, the right suburbs at the right time, and then, you know, make above average returns on their investment. It positively reinforces, it speeds up that journey and brings forward the choices and the freedom that we're all using property or stocks as a way to achieve that lifestyle. So, you know, there's such a opportunity cost that you're either gaining or losing by, you know, remaining ignorant to the fact of this stuff, or, you know, spending hundreds, if not thousands of hours consuming this content, reading the articles, studying the history so that we can make that journey just that little bit easier.
You know, I'd say to everybody that's still with us now, like, check out this book, The Secret Wealth Advantage. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it is definitely mine.
Also, no paid partnership with these guys.
Yeah, like, this is just because I just think it will massively change your life for the better. Incredible read. You can read a few pages at a time. It just really gives you an idea of, like, you know, how to safely navigate your way through the market over the coming 20 years. And it's like, it's not even what's coming in the next 2 or the next 4 that's important. It's like getting yourself set up for the next 14 years up run. Like, now that I know what I know, man, I'm going to do this thing so differently, and we'll talk about that in future episodes.
Keen as.
Cheers, bro. You. If you're thinking about buying an investment property in the next 3 months, then the team and I over here at Pumped on Property would love to offer you a free one-on-one strategy session. To book your session, all you have to do is jump over to www.pumpedonproperty.com and click that free strategy session button. Now, in that session, we'll talk about exactly where you are right now, where you'd like to be longer term, and educate you on the current state of the Australian property market. And then you can take that information with a grain of salt and go and absolutely smash it on your own, or potentially become one of the small number of clients that we choose to work with each week. But either way, we wish you all the best on your journey to financial clarity, financial peace, and financial freedom.